Welcome back to the 10 Adventures podcast. This week we are talking with somebody who knows a lot about adventure. From cycling around the world, walking across India, and rowing the Atlantic, Alastair Humphreys has explored the world and was named National Geographic Adventure of the Year in 2012. Alastair has also worked to raise awareness of adventures close to home, coining the term microadventures and recently writing the book Local, where he explores the 20 kilometers squared map around his home. Welcome to the podcast, Alastair.
Thank you for having me.
I'm super excited. I've read, I think, almost all of your books. I read your first book. I actually read your website while you were biking around the world, and
oh wow,
that got me to leave a job and go traveling myself. Not around the world, but I remember thinking, oh, maybe I should go do something like this. And I just spent the summer walking in the Alps. But yeah, from the early days, I've been a big fan of what you've written, and you've completed some incredible adventures. I mentioned you've cycled around the world, you've rowed the Atlantic Ocean, you've crossed the empty quarter, and I'm just wondering, what drove you to undertake these epic trips?
Well, I think my motivations evolved over the 20 or so years I've been doing adventures, but originally I was inspired by reading loads of adventure books and being curious about whether I might be able to try something similarly stupid and exciting to what I read in those books. And I was intrigued just to go to far off places and get away from boring old home, just like a lot of young, restless people. And then over time, my motivations have moved through all sorts of phases, through trying to prove myself to other people, test myself and prove something to myself. And increasingly, as I get older and care less about those things, more about just curiosity and enthusiasm for trying new things and just trying to shake up my days and make each day as adventurous as I can manage. So yeah, it's been an evolution of motives, which I guess happens to anyone over decades of their hobbies, life and career. And all those three things are the same for me, which sometimes makes things tricky.
What I'm really interested in is lots of people dream of doing these trips, but you actually do them. And so what is it about you that makes you go and undertake these trips that, when you first set off on your bike, people probably thought you were mad for wanting to do this?
Well, I'm very lucky now because I've done lots of adventures. It's quite easy for me to go and do lots of adventures, and it becomes sort of self-fulfilling. So the only really difficult or noteworthy thing, I suppose, was somehow daring myself to turn those daydreams, which, as you say, lots of us have, into an actual reality the first time. To dare myself to not just dream about cycling around the world and talk about it, but to actually get on my bike and pedal away from home. And I was aided in that partly by not really knowing what else to do with my life. I was a young guy who didn't really fancy sitting in an office yet for 50 years, so I needed to do something until I had to go sit in an office. So it was partly driven by that, but also I've always been quite conscious of the passing and pressing of time and just wanting to not waste my time. So I think I just realized that I've just got to grab this opportunity now, even though it's quite scary. And then once you've done that one adventure, then from then on, it just becomes easier and easier, really.
When you look at, the three adventures I mentioned, cycling the world, rowing the Atlantic, and crossing the empty quarter, how would you contrast and compare those? Obviously there's some similarities and there's some obvious differences, but are there maybe some subtle differences that people wouldn't think of off the top about those three trips?
Yeah, so I would actually say that rowing the Atlantic Ocean and crossing the empty quarter desert were virtually identical experiences. One was dry and sandy, one was wobbly and wet, but they were both wilderness experiences with a finite amount of supplies in which to get to the end, and they both involved me having to work and collaborate with one person in the desert and three others in the ocean. So a sort of team shared experience with all the ups and downs that involved. So I think of those two as being almost identical experiences. And then the different one would be cycling around the world, which was solo, and there's pros and cons solo versus other people. And also it was much more of a human-oriented experience. Pretty much every day cycling around the world, I was interacting with other humans, and so it wasn't. Although I was still in wild places quite often, it wasn't such an isolating experience as the desert and the ocean.
About a decade ago, you shifted to the concept of microadventures. Can you maybe describe what these are for people who haven't heard of this idea?
Yeah, so I think anyone can think of what an adventure means to them, and there's no point me defining it. It's much better that you who are listening define it for yourself. So dream of some sort of adventure, whatever that means to you, but then imagine that perhaps you don't have the time to do that, or the money to do that, or the expertise to do it, or you live in suburbia, not Siberia, and so you don't have the geography to do it. So now you have two choices. You can either think, oh man, that sucks, I'd love to do an adventure, but I can't. Or what a micro-adventure would be is to say, right, what is a small, simple, achievable, affordable version of that? Something that gives me a similar sort of experience, but one that I can perhaps squeeze into this weekend or even overnight once I've put my kids to bed. So it's basically the idea that it's always better to do some bit of adventure rather than no adventure at all. So it's about looking for the opportunities that do exist in your life rather than bemoaning and getting sad about the obstacles and the barriers and limitations that everyone faces.
And from the outside, it seems to me there was a shift from, you going on adventures yourself to trying to help regular people find adventure. And, is this something you consciously did? And if so, why do you think you changed?
I think it's a bit of an evolution, really. So before I cycled around the world, I trained to be a high school teacher. So when I was going around the world, I was talking in hundreds of schools, and I guess doing that was sort of trying to encourage young people towards, hey guys, there's some cool stuff beyond the end of your street, go have a look at it. So I've always been quite keen on that part of it, and adventures have done so much for me personally that I've really enjoyed saying to everyone, hey, this is great, this is not as hard as you think, go give it a try. So I've quite enjoyed doing that. And then the shift to micro-adventures came from realising that I was developing this audience of people who love the idea of big adventures. Hey, Al, tell us about cycling around the world. But we're not going to go do that themselves because they had a job and a mortgage and a husband and a wife and a cat, and maybe not a husband and a wife and a cat. That would be a complicated life, but complications in life. And so because I'd got so much from these wild adventures, I wanted to start to think, hey, maybe other people can start to do this as well. And I mean, I'm not exactly Mother Teresa, but once you start doing stuff that's nice to other people and you get emails from people going, hey, thanks so much for that idea, it was great. That just feels really nice. And I mean, I've loved my big adventures, but geez, there's enough middle class, privileged white men showing off about how tough they are in their amazing adventures. The world doesn't really need any more of that stuff. It's been great for me, but trying to encourage other people to adventure feels a little bit more useful as well with my time.
And then how have micro-adventures influenced you personally? Is there a favorite one that you do regularly?
Yes. So I think one of the challenging things when you're trying to tell stories and nudge people towards action is trying to come up with simple manifestations of your story that people can just grasp instantly, go, oh yeah, I get that, I can give that a try. So I fiddled around for quite a long time with all sorts of little micro adventures, but I think the one that connected the most and the one that I've probably enjoyed the most and that I repeat the most often was, rather than thinking too much about the 9 to 5, which grinds us down at times and gets in the way and spoils our adventures and all this sort of stuff, how about instead thinking about the 5 to 9? So when you finish work at 5 o'clock, hypothetically, you have nothing to do, hypothetically, until 9 o'clock the next morning. So rather than bemoaning our 8 hours of work, what about if we started to try and celebrate our 16 hours of potential theoretical freedom? So what I've been trying to do with my 5 to 9 micro adventures is the idea of, when you finish work one evening, turn off your computer, and instead of just going home to watch TV, just head out of town and go sleep on a hill for the night. Just do something overnight, and then wake up in the morning, get back to your desk, log on to Zoom, 9 o'clock the next morning, boom, ready to go. You've had a micro adventure, a disproportionately large wild experience squeezed in around the framework of busy real life. So yeah, the 5 to 9 overnight micro adventure, I think, is my favorite example of a micro adventure.
And kind of leading on from micro adventures, you've just written a new book called Local, which is a wonderful and thoughtful book about exploring your local ordnance survey map and searching for nature and wildness in your backyard. And I know a lot of our listeners aren't in the UK. Can you maybe just share the joy of the ordnance survey map?
Yeah, sure. So in Britain, we have many disastrous things. We were discussing before we started to record my terrible internet connection and the impossibility of exporting British cheese these days. But one thing we do have that's good is the Ordnance Survey maps. And they date back a few hundred years to when Britain was fighting the French, and we decided we needed decent maps. So all of Britain today is covered with fantastic high quality maps, the sort of resolution of map you'd use if you're going hiking in the mountains. And other countries have similar versions of them. There's the US Topo series in America. I can't off the top of my head think of the Canadian one, but I'm pretty sure you guys have the similar sort of thing. But so imagine the sort of map that you use to go hiking. On my map, it's 1 to 25,000 scale, and the whole map of the area where I live covers about 20 kilometers by 20 kilometers, broken up into 1 kilometer grid squares. So my idea was to try to spend a year exploring just where I live to see if I could find wildness close to home. And I did that by going out once a week to a randomly chosen grid square and doing my best to really explore that 1 kilometer area, to try and see everything in that 1 kilometer. And then by doing so, to try to get to know the place I lived better than I have done in all of my years wandering around the world.
Now, what I really love about this book is it's a beautiful and approachable way of bringing together lots of different thoughts and concepts about nature, which I'm sure we've all kind of felt or maybe thought about while out hiking or cycling. One concept that really struck me is you mentioned this shifting baseline syndrome for climate. Can you maybe share more about what that is?
Yeah, shifting baseline syndrome sounds quite boring and nerdy, but I think it's one of the most important concepts I've learnt about in a long time. And the essence of it is that we feel a bit sad, don't we, that nature isn't as good as when we were kids. Because when we were kids, there were loads of birds and loads of insects and everything was lovely. But actually, when we were kids, nature was still in a terrible state. We just thought that was normal to us. If you ask our parents, they would have a memory from when they were kids, which was better than ours. And our great-great-grandparents would have known an abundance that we can only begin to dream of. So each generation, the baseline of what we accept is normal and acceptable sinks a little bit lower. Standards slip. And so now when we try to conserve and get wild places back to what they were like, we're not getting them back to how they used to be 1,000 years ago. We're dreaming of getting us back to how they were when we were kids. And so in doing so, each generation erodes nature a little bit more. And once I became aware of that, I realized what a pernicious and problematic concept it is. So you start to see it everywhere once you're aware of shifting baseline syndrome.
And throughout the book, you mentioned kind of this importance of time alone in nature, and you give some examples of how kind of time alone in nature has been an important part of kind of human development. And I wonder if you could maybe share, your experience. You spent a lot of time alone in nature, and why you think it's so important for humans.
I've been very lucky to spend a lot of time in wild places on big expeditions, but I'm also in the real world like most of us, and I tend to spend most of my days frantically chasing emails and frantically checking Twitter and frantically checking the news and then charging around with far too many jobs to do. And I often in normal life forget to slow down and appreciate nature and the stillness and the calm and the peace and the happiness that comes from just sitting in the woods for a while. So one thing I tried to do while doing this book, by scheduling once a week to go out and explore a grid square, it was a way of bringing that time in the woods and the peace and quiet and the calm, bringing it into my daily busy schedule of sending emails. So some weeks I thought, oh, I'm far too busy to go and walk around that hill. I've got lots to do. But actually, they were the weeks when I appreciated it the most. So small little bursts of nature were really, really important to me this year.
You know, I really love how you talked about that, because I feel like our life is just, full of busyness and things to do, and we only get this time, away from all these distractions when we spend time in nature. And I know there's growing research showing the mental and health benefits of time in nature. And your book, paints a really powerful portrait of why time in nature is so valuable. But on the flip side, it feels like we're losing a war against meaningless time on social media and time spent indoors. And, with all these benefits, why do you think we're, fewer people seem to be spending time outdoors than, even a decade ago?
I think we tend to make a big mistake of muddling up the words important and urgent. And there's so much in our lives now that is urgent. I haven't checked Twitter for an hour. I better see if anyone said anything witty or clever about me. I haven't checked my email for 20 minutes. I'd better do that to reply to my boss. So there's a lot of things that are urgent demands on our time. But if we stop and think, they're not really important. When I get to be an old man, hopefully looking back on my life, I'm not going to reflect on the times when I managed to send all my emails. So I think we've just got ourselves into this crazy whirlwind of an urgent busyness and have lost track of what's actually really important, which is, I guess it depends for different people, but for me it's friends and family and doing stuff that is creative and purposeful, not just trying to send 1,000 emails and feeling really smug because I'm so busy.
You have an experiment you do in the book where you put the phone away and you spend 60 minutes on a log, not doing anything. And can you maybe describe the impact of 60 minutes without your phone, without any distractions?
I'm quite a hyperactive person, so spending even an hour in my own company seems like a daunting prospect. And what I try and do when I feel that I'm a bit overwhelmed and too busy is to willfully waste in quote marks, an hour of time by just sitting on a log in the wood. And I have to put my phone onto airplane mode and then physically chuck it to throw it beyond my reach, because otherwise I'll just get too tempted to start scrolling through Instagram looking at photographs of bicycles or something pointless like that. So I then have to just sit on this log and my mind just goes into a fury of boredom and chaos, and I'm thinking, I'm wasting my time. And yet gradually you settle into it and notice the birds and the insects and the way the light moves through the trees, and gradually settle into it. And every time I do this, when my alarm actually eventually sounds to tell me that the hour is up, I'm always surprised that my response is one of disappointment, not relief that the alarm has sounded and it's time to go home. So I think if you're listening to this and you feel you're too busy to go sit on a log, you probably really need to go sit on a log.
You talk quite a bit about this complex question of growth versus nature, and kind of my takeaway is our society is really on this race for growth, and we measure almost everything around growth. But there's other countries that measure kind of societal impact in different ways, and you talk about how Bhutan does. Can you maybe just share a little bit more on your thoughts on how we measure growth and success and as a society here in the Western world?
Yeah, most of our Western countries base our economies on gross domestic product, gross national product, how much we earn, and how much the economy is growing. If you want to get re-elected as a politician, then you have to promise, we're going to grow the economy. And yet, if you zoom back a little bit, that famous, wonderful photo of the blue marble of our tiny little planet floating in the blackness, we're a small, finite, spherical little planet in the middle of nowhere. It just literally cannot tolerate infinite growth. So at some point, infinite growth is what cancers do. At some point, planet's just not big enough for growth. So I think we need to start finding other ways to measure what the purpose of our lives are and to measure our perceptions of success. And Bhutan has a nice way of measuring this. They talk about the gross domestic happiness. So they actually measure and register and put value on how content their population is. And I don't want to get too wishy-washy, because of course we need to earn money in order to live and all those sorts of things. And I think that the economy done sustainably through green technology and things, there's no reason why you can't be both wealthy and sustainable. But I think things are quite skewed when we prioritize everything as being down to growth, because at some point the planet just ain't big enough for endless growth.
The book talks often about the state of public footpaths in the UK, and I've lived twice in the UK, and one thing that just amazed me was the ability to get out of London relatively easy and just basically walk in nature. And I was wondering if you could maybe just describe, what public footpaths are and how they're being impacted in the UK currently.
Yeah, we have this amazing network of footpaths in England and Wales alone. There's, I think, 140,000 miles of footpath, and many of these are thousands of years old. 7,000-8,000-year-old footpaths linking places together, and loads of them are 1,000 years old, linking little villages. And these are legal rights of way that go through farms and villages and all over the place. They're wonderful, and everyone has the right to walk on those. And I know that this network is the envy of many countries in the world, but gradually is the access and the rights are being eroded away, and there's a gradual loss of these footpaths now, that ones that aren't necessarily used very often or haven't been mapped correctly are in danger of being wiped off this legal map forever. So there's a push in the UK to save these lost these lost footpaths. About 40,000 miles of path are potentially due to be lost. So there's quite an urgency to reclaim them, because this network of footpaths across the country is a wonderful asset that we have here.
And one thing that's always at play is kind of the property owners, dislike of walkers typically. And you see lots of signs and have discussions with local farmers. What's it like, these days walking around London? Is it a kind of an aggressive aspect of local farmers and property owners towards walkers?
Well, I don't. I think aggressive is too strong, and I don't think it's any different now than it was 5, 10, 20 years ago, particularly, except that there is now more of an awareness of, although, so you have to now forget my last answer, which was saying how wonderful all these footpaths are. Yes, they are fantastic, but actually we only have a right to roam in England on about 8% of the land, which is tiny, and the rest is all privately owned, and privately owned by very, very few people. And we really don't have much wild open space in England. And so there's a growing movement, it's called the right to roam, to try and open up some of these places. Say, why the heck can't I go wander through this wood? Of course I'm not going to cause any damage. Of course I'm not going to leave litter or light fires. I'm not going to bother you in your homes. It's just I want to walk over that hill or through that forest. So no one owned that forest 10,000 years ago. So it's at some point someone put up a fence and said, this is mine, keep out. And that feels intuitively wrong to me. It certainly seems very different to, say, the more open spaces and traditional cultures of North America. But yeah, I know we have quite different land access issues across the Atlantic. But it's interesting to see the other side, to see it gives you a fresh perspective on your own good points and bad points, I suppose.
There's an interesting story in the book where you're talking to a local farmer, and he starts off very angry, but as you talk, he starts to realize you guys have common views on some things, and you even know somebody. Can you maybe talk about that story and what happened there?
Yeah, so I met this farmer. I was about to walk down a public footpath, so I was legally allowed to do so, but he got quite annoyed at me because he gets fed up of people walking through his field and in his mind scaring his cows and things. And it's interesting to try to see both sides of these things, because I'm legally allowed to walk down that footpath, not wander across the field, but wander down the actual path, the line. But equally for him, he's trying to have a farm and look after his cows, and I can see how it is annoying when hikers come walking backwards and forth, perhaps, especially if they drop litter or their dogs chase the animals. So I can see why it is annoying to him, but I'm allowed to do it. So we're having a bit of an argument about this. But I think the interesting part is that once he realised that we had a mutual friend in common, he became very apologetic that he'd been trying to stop me going on his land. And that made me realise that there is an issue with the countryside in Britain to do with whether you belong or not. So I'm a white middle-class man who spent a lot of my time in the countryside. I feel quite comfortable walking around fields and footpaths and reading maps and talking to farmers. That's my sort of normal life. How different that experience might have been had I been a black man or an Asian woman or a disabled person. And it made me realise there's an otherness to British nature and landscape. So it's not equally open to everybody, and I don't feel that that's right at all.
You mentioned a few times in the book about not living in, your ideal place. And I was interested, what would make a perfect town for you to live in?
Ooh. Well, I'd quite like to be able to go skiing over the weekend wherever I could live. That would be quite a nice thing to do. I'd like to live near I miss mountains, rivers that are big enough and clean enough to swim in or canoe on. I'd like to live near oceans with crashing waves, but I'd also enjoy living in a community whereby there were lots of other weird people like me who enjoyed running in the hills and camping and stuff. So I could go to a cafe or a pub and talk to people about these sorts of things. And where I live, which is a sort of suburban place just outside a big city, people don't really seem to engage with the outdoors at all, except to get in their car and drive to the shopping mall. So it's not my kind of place, really, which is one of the reasons why I decided to do this project, to try to accept, hey, this is where I live. Let's make the best of it. Stop complaining about the problems. Let's look for the good stuff, look for the opportunities, try and find some nature and wildness. And in that sense, it was a really successful year, because I realised that actually there's a lot more beauty and interesting stuff close to my home that I'd ever found, even after doing microadventures around here for many years.
I'm interested, the people who, just drive through nature, that never take the time to experience it. How do you get those people to take the step and start enjoying nature? Because I've always felt, once you spend time in nature and you realize the benefits of it, then you care a lot more about protecting it. But it feels like there's almost two different groups of people that, don't ever overlap. There's people that, spend their time not in nature, those that love doing it. And it feels like there's a communication problem to let the others know about the power.
Yeah, I totally agree with you there, that until someone cares about nature, then they're not going to bother about trying to save it. They're not going to vote for a government party that prioritizes it or change their lifestyle or their diets things. So I think that's a really important thing. How I'm going about that, well, this was one of the reasons that I started this project. So for 10 years, I've been doing microadventures, trying to encourage people to go hiking and biking and camping. And that's gone quite well. But in all those 10 years, I've always realized that I'm just preaching to the converted. I'm talking to people who are already a little bit interested in going camping and biking and being in nature. So what I wanted to try to do with this project, local, was to try and say, hey, wherever you live, even if you think there's no nature nearby, even if you're in a city, even if you don't own a sleeping bag and have no desire to run up a hill, even you can find nature and wildness close to home. So trying to reach a new audience of people who've never really considered themselves adventurous explorers was one thing I was exactly trying to do with this book. To say, even in your lunch hour, 1 mile from your office, you can be an explorer of the world. If you go somewhere you've never been before and you look at it with curiosity and enthusiasm, you're being an explorer.
My last question is, I'm interested, you've traveled the world, seen places and things that most people will never even read about. But how do you think all your travels have influenced your perception of the world and your place in it?
Oh, gosh, that's a big question. Well, traveling the world certainly made me very, very grateful that I grew up healthy enough, wealthy enough, with a decent enough pre-Brexit passport to give me the freedom to travel, the opportunity to travel. I've met so many poor people in different distant continents who would love to do the sort of things I do, but will never, ever, ever do that. So that's given me an urgency not to waste those gifts and opportunities. I think it's also given me a confidence to be willing to just go to new places and to trust that this will probably work out fine. Let's just go and see what happens. And I think the final thing I'd say on that is that how having seen lots of other parts of the world is now giving me an interesting twist on exploring my fairly boring suburban backyard to make me realize that actually there are interesting places close to home. I don't have to go to the other side of the planet for that to be an adventure. I can live a little bit adventurously right here, right now, if only I choose to do so. I think a lot of adventure in the end boils down to curiosity and your attitude.
Excellent. Alastair, thank you so much for coming on the show. It was great to talk about your book, and I urge everyone to pick up a copy, a local. You can get it within a minute if you go on Amazon. But for people who want to, learn more about you, how can they find you?
Well, my name's Alastair Humphreys, and you can then find me on Google, YouTube, Spotify podcasts, Instagram, all those sort of places, even LinkedIn. Look for Alastair Humphreys wherever you waste time on the internet, and you'll find me.
I follow you on LinkedIn, so I get lots of little tidbits and nuggets that way.
Ah, that's interesting, because all the stuff I put on LinkedIn, I just automate it from elsewhere. I literally never look there, so I'm glad to hear that it's useful.
Excellent. I'll put links to Alastair's website and some of his social channels, as well as to his book, in the show notes. And with that, thanks for listening to this episode of the 10 Adventures podcast. We'll be back next week to explore the world and hear about more epic adventures. Start planning your own adventure by visiting us at 10adventures.com and listen to other episodes of the 10 Adventures podcast on Amazon Music, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or anywhere else you find your podcasts.